After receiving one of the most unlucky F1 penalties in recent memory, Ferrari still has 2 shots at payback. Carlos Sainz copped a very controversial 10-place grid penalty for the Las Vegas Grand Prix after sustaining major damage because of a track fault just a few minutes into the new race's first ever practice session. Sainz struck a loose water valve inspection cover in FP1, which badly damaged his car's floor, chassis, seat and engine. Ferrari had to give Sainz a new battery among his replacement engine parts, which triggered an automatic 10-place grid drop because doing so exceeded his seasonal allocation for that component for the first time. Even the stewards knew this was massively harsh, acknowledging the damage was caused by highly unusual external circumstances and admitting they would have waived the penalty if only they had a legitimate way to do so. It sparked universal sympathy for Sainz and a few choice criticisms of the rules, the officials and the apparent political motivations of Ferrari's rivals for exactly why this penalty needed to be dished out and couldn't just be dismissed in such a freak scenario. Ferrari boss Fred Vasseur said it was stupid not to let the team off on reasons of force majeure. Sainz said he expected more from F1, and even his former teammate Max Verstappen called for rule changes despite gaining a place on the grid and a clearer shot at victory from Sainz's penalty. Verstappen also curiously claimed the team should not be allowed to have a say in these things because for sure they'll vote against that. Sainz would eventually follow up Verstappen's comments by calling it a business matter, stating there's too much money involved in the constructors or whatever for a team not to apply for a penalty for me. Both of them were obviously making thinly veiled observations that Ferrari's chief championship rival Mercedes blocked the stewards from helping in some way. We'll come to how Ferrari can exact vengeance on Mercedes in a moment, and in this video we'll also get into a more literal form of payback Ferrari might be able to achieve. But first, let's understand what really caused this, because teams can't, as Sainz put it, apply for a penalty, and despite the suggestion of rival interference, there was no vote, formally or informally, about whether Sainz should have been allowed to avoid one. Any influence from Mercedes or any other team would have been indirect, as in they had no avenue to block the stewards from granting a penalty exemption. But a threat of the decision being appealed, whether Mercedes had explicitly said they would do this or the stewards just had to be wary they might, would be a real factor. One of the main things the stewards consider when dealing with contentious matters, which an unprecedented allowance of someone not getting a mandatory penalty absolutely would be, is what would happen if their decision was appealed. They have to make sure their reasoning is robust, and one test of this is how confident they would be should the matter escalate to the International Court of Appeal. In this case, the only way to avoid giving Sainz a penalty would be to cite force majeure, which Ferrari obviously felt was stupid not to consider. The International Sporting Code defines this as an unpredictable, unpreventable and external event. Arguing what happened is predictable or not external would seem foolish, but while this is still a harsh interpretation, it may not have been unpreventable. Even though Ferrari and Sainz couldn't have done anything about this part, clearly it was preventable from a circuit point of view because the water valve cover should never have come loose. And it's worth noting there was a yellow flag deployed at the scene. Ferrari argues this means the FIA must have been aware there was a problem on track and could have intervened sooner with a quicker red flag, not just a yellow one. But a yellow flag does mean a driver is required to reduce your speed, do not overtake and be prepared to change direction as there is a hazard beside or partly on the track. And while we don't think this would be a fair interpretation, this at least makes it possible for lawyers to argue the incident could have been avoided or mitigated by Sainz and Ferrari. We also understand why the likes of Verstappen, not just the Ferrari camp, were arguing the rules have to change. Verstappen is still sore over the penalty he eventually took in 2021 after losing an engine in the huge crash he had with Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone, so we know he has his own reasons for arguing this point. But if a sensible framework existed so that this kind of thing could be dealt with through common sense, then we'd be all for that. Clearly, Sainz was massively unlucky here. At the moment, while it would be good in theory to apply common sense in such situations, F1's competitive reality makes that difficult to enforce. And if force majeure were applied in this scenario, it would definitely set a precedent, meaning teams would undoubtedly start lobbying for it to be applied in other circumstances, making it difficult for officials to know where to draw the line. Sainz and Ferrari were unsurprisingly still bitter about this at the end of the Las Vegas weekend, given the strong performance of their car. Starting first and second on the grid would have given them a better shot at succeeding in a race Charles Leclerc came close to winning while fighting the Red Bulls single-handedly. And given Ferrari was clearly quicker than Mercedes this weekend, Sainz's penalty did in hindsight stop Ferrari reclaiming second in the championship. But there was a silver lining in the form of Sainz beating both Mercedes drivers anyway as part of his recovery drive to 6th, and that meant Ferrari did move to within just 4 points of Mercedes in the constructors' standings. You can guarantee this was very satisfying to Sainz and anyone at Ferrari who felt Mercedes was the only reason they had to serve that penalty in the first place. It has set up a final race showdown in Abu Dhabi for a very valuable position in terms of prize money and competitive kudos. That's payback of sorts, but there could be more coming. Team boss Fred Vasseur said a fortune is a good estimation of the cost of the damage sustained in Sainz's crash, and separately suggested it was worth a couple of million euros. This will have to come out of Ferrari's capped budget for the year, and even though teams build in a crash damage allowance, it is going to be a tight one to manage at the end of the season. There will be extra costs involved as Ferrari cannot repair the chassis, so needs to bring another spare out to Abu Dhabi for the finale, on top of all the costs associated with the various parts that got replaced and whatever other spares may now need to be restocked. The crumb of comfort is that Ferrari has a very good case to claim compensation. There is clear precedent from 2 recent incidents where a car suffered significant damage because of faults relating to the track surface. The Baku City circuit had to reimburse Williams for the cost of damage incurred when George Russell struck a loose drain cover in 2019, and Haas won compensation from the Sepang circuit when the same thing happened to Romain Grosjean in Malaysia in 2017. Ferrari will take the matter up with the Las Vegas Grand Prix, which is effectively F1 itself, given the commercial rights holder is uniquely also the promoter of this event. Sainz's 10th-place grid drop was the most egregious penalty in Vegas, but it wasn't the only contentious one. We also had more evidence to support the growing case against the penalty that is clearly unfit for purpose in F1. Verstappen picked up this season's latest high-profile 5-second penalty for his move on Leclerc at the start, where he pushed the Ferrari wide into the runoff area when taking the lead. We've talked in detail recently on this channel about how drivers are abusing the 5-second penalty, sometimes even going as far as deliberately making an illegal move they know will benefit their race by a greater amount than the time penalty they'll inevitably have to serve. While it's unlikely Verstappen weighed that up in the split second he had to make his move at the start, he and his team were able to make a judgment call in the laps that followed. And once the Red Bull pit wall learned that Verstappen's move was under investigation, it decided it was better to keep the advantage of track position over Leclerc and run the risk of receiving the relatively gentle penalty, rather than try to avoid the penalty by making the more sporting move of giving the place back on track. There was nothing wrong with Red Bull's decision here. It knew that keeping Verstappen out front was the safer route, and it also kept him in clean air, which would help with managing his tyres. That's why Verstappen was also so nonchalant when told about the penalty, telling Red Bull to give the officials his regards. The flaw here is in the rules themselves, which allow a transgressor to decide a course of action before penalties are applied. Because of this, they can choose to do what they calculate will have the least impact on their own race, taking a degree of agency away from the officials. And that highlights one of the many areas where the 5-second penalty falls down as a fitting punishment, by being served either at a driver's next pit stop or at the end of the race if there are no more stops to make. It creates too much distance between the offence being committed and the penalty being served. So using the Verstappen example, if a driver commits an offence at the first corner of the race, they shouldn't get to wait 16 laps before paying the price for that, as was the case last weekend. At most races this year, Verstappen would easily have been able to build a 5-second gap before his first pit stop, meaning the penalty would have achieved nothing. In this case, Leclerc was able to catch and pass Max before the Red Bull stopped. But how different might the first stint have played out had Leclerc been given track position during the first couple of laps if Verstappen was ordered to give the place back? Verstappen didn't see it that way and felt that if he'd given the place back, it would have probably cost him around the same amount of time across his entire race, so he doesn't see what all the fuss is about. Ultimately, like with Sainz, according to the way F1 works, the right penalty was applied. smaller time penalties were brought in because the time lost to drive-throughs or stop-goes was often considered too severe for minor offences. Unfortunately, the main penalty that has replaced them is often not severe enough and lacks the immediate impact on a driver's race needed for it to act as a true deterrent. And, like with Sainz, it shows that F1's rules can be applied correctly, but at the same time make it feel like the right thing has not been done at all.